For those of you who've been looking for Season 1 of Solarpunk Presents, but haven't been able to find it, here it is. Originally, it was published as part of Solarpunk Magazine's Solarpunk Futures podcast. We're reposting our episodes on our site to make them easier for you to listen to if you didn't catch them the first time. We hope you enjoy them. Also, don't forget to support us by spreading the word about Solarpunk Presents, writing us a review, or subscribing to our Patreon at patreon.com/solarpunkpresents. Hello and welcome to Solarpunk Presents, the companion podcast to Solarpunk Futures. Hosted by Solarpunk Magazine nonfiction editors extraordinaire Ariel Kroon and Christina Della Rocha. Ariel and I will be using this companion podcast to Solarpunk Futures to explore solarpunk goings-on in the world today. We'll be interviewing all sorts of interesting people who are doing work in the here and now that will help us get to a solarpunk future. And we'll be talking to each other about the visions of a sustainable, equitable future integral to solarpunk, and about issues we're curious about within the movement or genre, or whatever it is you want to call solarpunk. Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of Solarpunk Presents. I had a nice discussion with Professor Lisa Dilling of the University of Colorado at Boulder about climate resilience. Here's the episode. Hello, Lisa. Thank you for talking to us today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Christina. It's great to talk to you. And I'm Lisa Dilling. I'm a professor here at the University of Colorado in Boulder in the United States. And what I study mostly is climate change, and especially how we use scientific information to make decisions, and how that interface works between science and different kinds of decisions we might make. And a decision could be anything. It could be how you decide to, a decision to carry an umbrella would be like a weather decision, but climate could be lots of different decisions about climate change. But I've been especially studying adaptation policy, also a little bit on carbon management and offsets, like how we manage carbon, try to absorb more carbon into the soils and the ocean. And before I was a professor, I worked in DC managing science programs. So I know a lot about sort of the science policy decision-making interface, and that tends to drive my work a lot, right? How to make science kind of more usable for those decisions.
Okay, yeah, so also studying the glacial pace of turning science into climate policy and actual action.
It's pretty fascinating. And I mean, there are moments of real progress, and you can see, wow, that is different now. People are using that information, and sometimes you have, like you mentioned, glacial progress, but how sometimes in the plates you have an earthquake, you have like a shift really quickly.
Oh, like the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, things happen very quickly.
It changes everybody's energy policy.
Yes, exactly. So I think, yeah, it's kind of one of those things it's not something most people think about, where research and science, like where it comes from, and then how it makes its way into the policy practice, sphere. But it's actually a pretty fascinating topic, and finding ways to make that interface work better. It's pretty cool, because there's lots of ways to do it. It could be on the science side, or it could be on the decision side. It could be, convening workshops. It could be making conversations happen, that kind of thing.
Between scientists and policymakers, or politicians, or scientists and citizens. I mean, not that scientists aren't also citizens.
It could be all of those things, honestly. I mean, it's usually not the really high level, like, politicians meeting scientists, although, those happen in very, very organized ways, like through testimony in Congress and things like that. But oftentimes it's actually, like, I've had experiences where we go have a workshop in a town who's just been experiencing drought, a lot of drought, and they are having trouble. They've not experienced like sort of the level of drought that they've experienced in this time, and so they're trying to figure out what to do with it. How to think about this. Like, is this something that's going to keep happening? Is this something they have to prepare more in the future? We can sort of offer a little bit of scientific context and background for their situation and say, yeah, this is what we know about how the atmosphere is changing and how the water cycle is changing, increased temperature, like for climate change, what that's doing, therefore, this is what we can say about the propensity, the likelihood of droughts happening more. And so that gives them that little piece of information where they're like, oh, maybe it's worth it to invest in a second water treatment plant, for example, so that we can use more of the water we have rights to and stuff like that.
Okay, so you actually have municipalities sort of calling you up and asking you to come to workshops, or you arrange workshops and you invite mayors and city planners, or I mean, how does this happen?
Well, yeah, it's a great question. And I've been part of a group that's like specifically working on this interface of science and decision making. And it tends to be us mostly like on the science side or on the research side, the academic side, trying to reach out to folks in the regular world or the, not that we're all in the real world, but in the non-academic world, to say, hey, we have, this is our mission, really, like trying to bring climate information to people where it can make a difference. And so this is a group I was in charge of for like 7 years or so. And we had funding from the federal government to do this work on a regional basis to bring people together to kind of use scientific information better in their decisions. And so what we did actually for that example I was talking about is we wanted to have some workshops around Colorado to talk to people about how they were thinking about adaptation and how what kind of needs they had for information, what would make them more resilient in the face of climate change. We actually got in contact with people a couple different ways. One of the ways was through our network of people we'd already been talking to through other projects, so that we would, knew a water manager in a town, or we knew somebody. And so we were like, hey, is your town interested in this kind of information? But we also put literally like the ad in the paper kind of a thing where we put an announcement in a newsletter for municipalities to say, is any community interested in working with us? Because it's quite an effort to have a workshop, and we interview people ahead of time and we write a big report at the end for them and help facilitate and so forth. So we wanted people to participate who really wanted this, to happen. And we got a couple great communities that were really, it was just the right time for them to be engaged in this conversation because they were thinking about what they could do, next. And they had these climate changes that were basically manifesting right there, right that year. And so, yeah, so it goes both ways, but it's mostly like kind of a long-term building up of relationships most of the time, where sometimes people call in, they say, hey, trying to figure out what these changes mean for my water planning, like, can you help me out? Or, we might reach out, we say, we want to have some work in the Southwest Colorado, are you interested in working with us? And so we might reach out to them. So it works both ways.
Okay. So what kind of climate change manifestations are you having in Colorado?
We are in the middle of the country, for your listeners, just picturing it, we're kind of one of the states where the Rocky Mountains goes right through. So we have this really big mountain range in the middle of our state. And so we kind of are in almost two different climate zones when you look at, the kind of eastern half is really dry, and then the mountainous half on the west is kind of more all of the snow. And actually, really interestingly, we hear about the Colorado River. It's one of our major rivers in the western US, and it provides water to about 42 million people in the West.
Wow.
And the Colorado River starts in Colorado. I mean, it's like headwaters are here in Colorado. And so the amount of snow that falls in Colorado is super important for water for the rest of the whole Colorado basin, because it basically falls as snow and then melts, and goes into the river. And most of the water is coming from this snowpack melting. So one of the big changes that we're seeing is and this is a pretty robust finding. Like, there's different levels of certainty about what might happen in the future. But one of the things we know pretty much for sure is that temperature is rising, and it's rising here in Colorado. And so if you have snowpack, snow as one of your main sources of water, you're very vulnerable to temperature increases. Basically, what you're seeing is less snow falling as snow, less precipitation falling as snow, more falling as rain. Our runoff season starts a bit earlier now, just because seasonality is changing on that.
Okay, so the mountains are getting less snow and they're not storing it.
And we don't have a lot of we have reservoirs on the Colorado, for example, but it's very dry, the Western US in general. Like we don't have big lakes, that are huge reservoirs for the most part. So it's kind of like our reservoir of water is the snowpack. And this is true for us in the Rocky Mountains, and it's true for people who are getting snow, like in the Seattle area, their water comes a lot from the Cascade Mountains, California. California gets water from here, actually, from the Colorado River, but they also get water from the Sierra Nevada mountains. And all of those mountains, are going through the same thing. Mountains worldwide are going through the same thing, where this kind of warming trend is making that snowpack more vulnerable. It's just kind of like that storage place we used to have, that cold snowpack is just getting a little bit less reliable. And so that's one thing we're seeing already is our snowpack changing, the form of water changing to be more rain. And we've already adapted quite a lot, obviously, for over the centuries to a dry West, by building some reservoirs and conveying water, moving water from place to place in pipes and things to irrigate fields, things like that. But all of those things we built are geared for a certain type of climate variability, like a certain range of climate and water availability. So with this change in climate change, we're kind of learning how to manage that water differently. We don't necessarily have the storage in place, although, well, I should say, one manifestation of this, you asked about, like, what are we seeing? If you look along the Colorado River right now, there's several reservoirs, and there's a couple really big reservoirs. Those reservoirs are way down. Think 30% of what they can normally hold. And that's been a drought that's been going on for about 20 years now. Where this kind of is hitting the road, the rubber hitting the road, if you will, is, now the federal government that kind of oversees the management of the Colorado River system is telling states, you need to start thinking about cutbacks, thinking about how to take less water next year, like very, very soon. And that's having a real impact already on agriculture, and thinking about, how cities might respond and so forth.
So I don't know if I should ask you, how do you adapt to that? Or if I should ask you, how do you build climate resilience to that? Because those are two slightly different things, or are they the same thing? Maybe I should just start by asking, what is climate resilience?
Yeah, that's something that scholars are arguing about in the literature. Basically, there's a lot of writing about what is climate resilience even. But there's a couple different ways of thinking about it. And one way is to think about it as, if you think about human resilience, when you think somebody's resilient, probably you're saying that because they've had something bad happen to them, but they've bounced back from it. And I mean, that's one way that people talk about climate resilience, is they think about the ability to kind of maintain function, maintain life, maintain energy access, food access, different kinds of things that we need as a society to live, maintaining that, bouncing back from shocks. So, if something happens, are you able to kind of be resilient and come back? But there's another area of thinking that's saying, well, we don't really necessarily want to bounce back, because we're actually in a changing climate. So the ground is shifting, underneath us. We don't want to necessarily bounce back to what we had before, or what we were doing before. Even we really want to think about either the concept of like bouncing forward, like building a different way of being with this changing climate, or people use the word transformation, where it's like actually transforming our relationship with the climate, the environment, what is sustaining, our society. But I mean, resilience generally, I think people, can think of it as not trying to get totally knocked down, by say a drought, or a fire coming, or like, so when you ask about adaptation you might think of as kind of the actions you might take to be more resilient in the end. So,
okay,
I think of adaptation as sort of changing the things we're doing, or the way we're building, or the way we're maybe organizing our networks and so forth. But to be more resilient, to be able to withstand these shocks and stresses, and maybe not just withstand them, but actually build forward and be more forward thinking about the way we're living. And I say that also because of the concept of things like justice. I think you've talked about justice before in the program, and there's a lot of situations around the world that are not great right now. Like things are resilient, people are resilient, but they're kind of ground down. They're kind of, they're not living in a very equitable situation. They're not living in a very, in a situation that allows them to thrive and really come to their full, human potential. Thinking about resilience, how do we actually build a different way of being, living in concert with the environment and with each other, of course, as people, so that we're not running into these really big inequities and these really big problems, in the way that we've built things that are just not sustainable.
Okay, so when you have these workshops, or you meet with people working for City Hall, as it were, who are probably just, I would assume they're more interested in actually adapting to climate change. Do they want to incorporate this social justice aspect into their planning?
There are some amazing efforts right now to really build justice in and looking forward. And I know about one about in terms of the energy transition and sustainability in an urban environment. So I can just mention that the city of Denver, which is, just down the road from Boulder, like about 30 minutes or so, they have a dedicated team basically working on justice and what that means, not just as a hand wavy topic, but like, what does that mean when you start to think about sustainability in the city? Like, what does justice mean? There's actually like some practical things you can do, and some things we know, unfortunately, that have already happened. Like you might think, like, say, greening neighborhoods, of putting trees into neighborhoods. People talk about the value of having shade trees or helping to cool the urban environment. And when you look at the map, though, where trees are existing right now in an urban environment like Denver, they correlate with the richer neighborhoods. The richer neighborhoods have a lot more trees than the poorer neighborhoods. And so thinking about like things like that, like a strategy of tree planting, for example, thinking about, well, where are you going to do that, and how are you going to make sure that that benefits the people that are the most vulnerable to heat?
It seems like kind of a no-brainer, you would think. But so, I mean, so there are more trees in the richer neighborhoods because they have bigger yards and they have gardeners, or because the city planted, I mean, because there's city-owned trees, right, on the sides of the streets, I presume, and then there's privately owned trees. I mean, is the difference because there's more privately owned trees in the richer areas?
That I don't know. I don't know why it is to start with, but my guess is that, as we know from historical planning, city planning, when a neighborhood gets planned, if it's like if it was the older, more established neighborhood, maybe the nicer place to be, the first place that got built upon, they probably were planting trees there, to go along with the houses and so forth that they were building. This is the first sort of community that was getting built. And then as more people moved in and more city land was established, maybe people weren't as wealthy, or maybe it was just there were less, it's hard to know.
The lots get smaller, or because they're more expensive now.
And I don't know the reasoning, but there's also been a history of racism in like redlining and in designating certain neighborhoods as these are going to be the areas that, we're going to put certain people here, and we're going to have like these people living over here. And that correlates as well with green space, with parks, with trees and so forth. I saw this really interesting study in LA. It was mapping benefits for flood protection and green space and trying to look at whether they could put those sort of in the same place. In other words, like trying to do double duty with the land they would need. But it's not always the same. It's not always where you have a need for flood mitigation isn't necessarily where you might have a need for trees, and for planting trees. So you have to really look at how it factors out, and then who's the community living there. And you mentioned also a really good point, which is who's going to look after the trees. Is it the community's job to look after the trees? Is it the city's job to look after the trees? In our area too, as I mentioned about the water, water's a big issue. So to really be careful, I think systems thinking about it. But there was a study in Detroit I was reading where this community group wanted to bring in, or it was an outside group actually wanted to plant trees. But the city residents there were saying, hey, we have trees, but the problem is, the city's supposed to help maintain these trees, and our sidewalks are broken, and our sewers are busted, and all of these like infrastructure pieces are not working. We don't have any faith that you're going to actually, these trees are going to survive or, be maintained. I mean, building the trust is also, this sounds like far, but it's actually the core of building a resilient society, is having trust among people who are trying to actually build something for the future. Because right now that trust is broken down in a lot of places, and especially in these places where, inequality is really, really big. And there's been a history of, not caring for all communities equally, not actually giving communities the rights that they need and the land that they need and so forth. And so that kind of is still perpetuated. So we need to understand kind of the baseline, I guess, of where we're coming from on this, and then think about how to build resilience with an equity lens, I guess you would say. But I think, like I say, Denver has this team of people who, they've got the data, so that science into practice is happening. They've looked at these maps and this data, and then they're looking creatively of how to spend the money, to put these kinds of values in. I know there are efforts too on energy transition things, which are like, for example, electrifying buildings. So trying to get fossil fuel, like trying to get methane gas out of buildings so that, we can reduce our emissions there.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, that's an issue for a low-income community that isn't going to have the money to just go electrify, with a new heat pump. So the city is really putting a lot of effort into figuring out, how to make this transition, how to provide the funding, provide the support, the contractors, make it work with a way that actually works for that community too. That's the other interesting thing from the Detroit thing and the stories we hear. It's really important to have communities be defining for themselves what they want this resilience to look like. Like I can talk from an academic sense and say, well, here's how it's defined, and here's the 7 metrics, or, something to measure resilience. But what people actually themselves, what they think resilience means and what it means to them, and how they would like to, how they'd like to see their community change it may be completely different. And it's really important, I think, to start from there, to start from sort of where people are in their community and what they want to see for themselves in their own community, because otherwise it's kind of an external pressure to say, oh, well, let's help you adapt, or let's help you do these different things. But really empowering communities is a big part of not only building resilient communities, but also building a future that's equitable.
So how do you go out there and make connections with people in the communities? This must be difficult. How do you find people? How do you connect with them?
Well, it's fun, but it's difficult. It's time consuming. I would say it's not fast. And that's because trust is an important part. You can't just go and like do a month project. Oh, okay, I'm going to go into your community and build resilience with you, as an outsider. It just, it takes literally years sometimes to get to know a community, help understand what the needs are, what people are really thinking about. I also think too, there's a part of it that's tough for academics to do, which is it requires sometimes stepping outside of your comfort zone and being an advocate for that community, which sort of not usually trained as advocates in academia. We're very data driven. We're sort of very, trying to be objective, even though we know objectivity is a little bit not real. But the important thing is to build relationships with people who can trust you and you trust them and so forth. Sometimes it isn't possible though to build that relationship necessarily directly. So sometimes it's like there's a way of working with community groups who then go and work in their own community. So kind of that chain of connection is really helpful, because it's hard, like you say, like we have like a group of, 5 people or, a few people at the university working on this. We can't possibly reach all the communities that might need to be working on resilience. So we have to think about how to kind of scale that up, or how to work with the community groups that are in the community already, and then have them work with people actually out there. So it's not actually all of us. It's not necessarily all of us directly working with every individual person. Sometimes it's try to think how you can amplify sort of your knowledge and the work you can do with working with trusted partner groups.
Yeah, no, this is great. I mean, this is what we do best as a species is, I mean, aside from destroy things, is organize ourselves into groups and then have nodes and networks and webs and all this kind of stuff, for better and for worse, I suppose.
We were studying this group of water managers in Colorado to find out if they were adapting or how they were using scientific information to respond to drought and how they were changing their practices in their water management utility. And what we were finding is a lot of these very small towns and smaller, areas with a kind of pretty small utility, maybe they have one person, running their water utility. They all tend to trust, like, there's certain people in their network that they'll call up and say, hey, what's the season going to look like? Or what are you seeing out of the snowpack this year? Or kind of trying to get that information from these nodes in the network. And those nodes are super important for disseminating this information more broadly to the smaller, even not just smaller, but bigger as well. And so we were sort of saying at the end, like, maybe organizations like mine at the university, we should be thinking about identifying who are these nodes, who are these people who are going to have a wide reach, and really trying to work with them so that they have the best knowledge that we can give about, how climate's changing and how to be thinking about this observation they're making about the snowpack. And then they can kind of pass that out to other people as they call in. And I think we found, I mean, this wasn't our term, other people have used this term, but like a community of practice. It's also who those people trust the most. Like, they trust other water managers, people who've been through this, they know what the risks are. They know how to manage their system. Me as an academic, I'm sitting here going, well, here's some knowledge I have, but I'm not on the line. If I make a wrong decision about the reservoir and letting out the water, that's not, I'm not making that decision. It's the water managers themselves that are making that decision. And so understanding that, they are the ones who have to absorb the information, make the call. And so there's a lot of trust between the water managers because they basically understand what the risks are and how to.
It's a question of time scale, right? So they're responding to, so they have a short-term response. They're calling up the guy who knows about the snowpack. But what you're offering them is predictions and information about what's coming in over the next 5 years or 10 years or 40 years. So these are also two slightly different things, right?
Yes, it's like I think of it as giving the context, sort of, because people sometimes want to know, well, I mean, we can't give actually a good prediction for next year's snowpack. It's just too uncertain, really, that it's still a pretty hard science to predict what's going to happen next year with a particular variable. But we can place the pattern that they're seeing into this bigger context. We can say, hey, this pattern you're seeing is part of a larger trend. And yes, you might get another wet year, but on balance, you're going to get drier. This atmosphere being thirstier, this temperature going up, there's just more water being held into the atmosphere, and and your soils are going to get drier. You're kind of going through this much drier time, and the snowpack runoff will become less efficient. So that's where we have that kind of contextual knowledge that we can give to the water managers who are dealing with that call on this particular year. It helps them spread the information of, like, again, planning for maybe some more storage, maybe some more efficiency measures. Maybe you have more kind of water rights contracts that are, can exercise an option on some extra water in a bad year, creative ways to try to get through the shortages that could be happening more and more. And we're seeing a lot of that experimentation. I mean, people are just amazingly creative and, have a lot of different ideas of how to get through this kind of thing. But it's something that I think they still need that sort of sense that this is a real thing that is happening and there's a physical explanation for it. It's not just a political statement. There's still a lot of politics around climate change here. I think finally it's getting ingrained that no, this is actually a real thing, and we need to be thinking about how to adapt and how to make ourselves more resilient.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I imagine there's a lot of resistance within the agriculture industry to changes to their water rights or to their water use. I mean, because obviously they need to make money.
Yes, and the thing with farmers and producers is they are totally aware that the environment's changing. They're really smart on the ground. They know their business, they know what they're seeing. And like you say, they're running a business. There's a lot of statements out here because agriculture uses like 80% of the water. Cities are, we could get better at being more efficient, but overall we're a pretty small part of the consumption of water compared to agriculture, especially because it's so dry here. We have to irrigate quite a lot. So yeah, for farmers, ranchers, producers who use irrigated agriculture, water is life. Water is their business.
Are there also groups working on building or helping the agriculture adapt to climate change or building resilience into the agricultural system? I mean, I presume so.
There are. We in my group, we focus on like utilities, water utilities, cities, towns, that kind of area, those kinds of stakeholders. But there's a whole different group that's funded out of the US Department of Agriculture. They have a network of climate hubs. So the US Department of Agriculture has like a nationwide network of these climate hubs located across the country, and we have one here in Colorado, and they are working with producers, farmers, ranchers to figure out exactly what you're saying, like how do we build resilience into our practices. And because they're USDA and because they have a long history of ag extension is like when you have people embedded in the community who they're doing exactly what I've been saying I'm doing, like, trying to bring science to the community and also bring questions back to the university to research. So ag extension has been doing this for 100 years now, where farmers say, hey, I've got this strange, weevil, eating my crops. What is this? How do I get rid of it? So forth. And the researchers at the university will kind of research that and then bring that answer back. And so that exchange has been going on. But they've now funded these climate hubs that are focused on tools and information and ways of helping producers cope with climate change. Just to give an example, there's this new tool that has come out. It's like a model combined with a vegetation prediction sort of, and they call it grass cast. So
Cool.
like grass cast.
Yeah.
And the grass cast is kind of like a forecast of what's the grass going to be like for your animals, like for ranchers in the next season. And it's cool because it's like kind of like a way of using that science, using new techniques and tools, but towards a product that really speaks to a particular group of people who really need that information.
Right. And then they can decide how many new cows or if they need to reduce the size of the flock or flock
The herd.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. And maybe even smaller decisions like, laying in more grain or, what kind of, stocking rates and things like that. And they're also studying actually on the sustainability side that USDA has like a bunch of really cool plots of different kinds of range stocking, different amounts of cows on the each type of field, or what kinds of feeds, like they just have a lot of ways that they're looking scientifically at how to best support farmers and bring them into bring them best practices that can help. And farmers get a lot of information too from private sector companies, people that are selling. There's amazing tools out there that can beam back like data and sensing, sense information about the state of your field, about like the weather, what does this say? When should you put your fertilizer on so it doesn't run off as much, trying to be more sustainable. There's a lot of really cool innovations in that area, but there is this one focus on the climate, on these climate hubs that's really cool, specifically on that question you were asking.
So it's amazing that there's this level of trust between farmers and scientists. I wouldn't have expected that. I mean, I guess
particular kind of scientists. So these are people who work, they're ranchers themselves often. Like I know one of these folks, he's a PhD, studies rangeland science, has his own ranch and does a lot of science with ranchers. I really think that's going to the trust issue of they're willing to work with him because he's one of them. He's a rancher. He knows what they're at. He's not trying to convince them they shouldn't be doing what they're doing. He's really on their side. And it's different than if I were to go and say, hey, can I work with you? I
Mhm.
mean, there's communities where I'd be more, maybe, some of the communities that we work with and have a long relationship with, I'd be more trusted. But the ranch communities, that relationship has been built over many years with this agricultural extension and these rangeland scientists that have been in the community.
Wow. So I see this is really, really important to have this kind of a complex network.
Yes. Yeah.
Because we're facing this massive, massive crisis that's coming at us faster and faster each year. There isn't time to build trust where there isn't already a relationship of trust. You do have to somehow already find people who you can liaise through in order to get
Exactly.
information flowing.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. It's really, and we have the cool thing again, I feel like with this little area that we work in here, I'm more part of this one organization that's funded by NOAA. It's used to be called the RISA. Now it's called the Climate Adaptation Partnership Program. But so there's one organization, there's this USDA Climate Hub also in the same area. And there's another organization funded by the Department of Interior. So they run like the national parks and the BLM, big landowner that's kind of in the West. And they focus on supporting ecosystem resource managers, people who are managing, wilderness and park service, other kinds of kind of entities within their mandate. And the cool thing is we have like retreats or meetings like every 6 months to basically kind of share notes, across these three entities, knowing who's around you and who is got a network connection with some people or could help. Like if a farmer came into us and said, hey, I really want to find out more about climate change for my area, I would refer them to the USDA Climate Hub because they've got that information there. I don't need to reinvent that wheel, but the fact that I know that they exist means I can direct that person more quickly and efficiently. And keeping those networks up and that web of connection, it's like not just one community of practice, it's like how these communities of practice kind of connect and kind of making sure that you're aware that you're not an island, you're actually more of like a nerve center sort of thing, where you're like doing your thing, and then you've got these connections out to these other hubs that are doing their thing, and making sure that we are just kind of coordinated so we kind of can share information and be more efficient. But the trust part, exactly, the trust part is built over many years. So not trying to reinvent that, but really trying to reach out to kind of partners that have that trust already built.
I really love this because, everyone always thinks, about climate change. Oh, the technology is going to save us, but technology alone can't do this, right? You have to have people working together and communicating, and that just isn't talked about nearly enough, I think. But, you don't see it so much in the newspapers, for instance.
We love tech. We love technology and gadgets, and investors love it. And it is needed. It's cool. And whether it's resilience or energy transition, we need physical infrastructure. We need objects, to be built and things like that. But just like you said, it is not possible without the human capital, basically the social capital. We call it like social capital because it like other kinds of capital. Social capital is these networks, these relationships, the trust that people have, anything that's basically like sort of an intangible, but it's very real because it actually allows a society to function.
Yeah.
And it allows you to actually know that you have trust in the guy installing your new heat pump, that's going to work, or we need to be accelerating basically the human side of this transition and building resilience. Like I was mentioning about the community of practice, it's not just building a reservoir or something like that for water. It's not just building a new transmission line or a new solar panel farm or something like that. I mean, you can't just go build those things, right? You have to have people willing to let you build those things and to help site them and make sure they're not going to have negative effects, make sure they're not impinging on disproportionately impacted communities, all these different things. What is that? That is social capital. That is like relationships. That is trust. That is making sure we are on the same page about, or we get to the same page anyway, about making sure that our way forward is working for everyone and is actually going to do what we hope it will. You can it's like I think in the 70s, remember we had the oil shock. There was this oil crisis, and there was all this interest in things like solar panels and things that would heat your water on your roof and different things like that. But, it kind of fell by the wayside in the 80s. It was like suddenly like, no, we're going to do something different or whatever. That's one of the things I worry about, is without everybody sort of coming along and understanding why things are important, and understanding, basically trusting that this is all for the greater good, and that we're all in this together, and having some say in how things evolve and how they kind of get carried out, like the farmers, and this thing about water and sharing it, with cities. It is all about trust, because otherwise, the farmers, I can tell you, they are nervous about this trend of trying to give more water to the cities, because what's to stop the politics in the future saying, well, sorry, people are going to not have any water, you need to just give it over. I mean, obviously we have laws, hopefully that doesn't just happen, but you can imagine there's some resistance to experimenting in this way if they feel like they're just going to lose, that this is a losing proposition. So I think we need to really understand this human dynamic to this, the behavior part of it, just the relationship part of it, and the trust part of it. These are essential ingredients to either resilience or sustainability transitions in general. It's really the social side. I mean, that's kind of what I've been really moving towards. You and I met, in biology, kind of like studying biological systems. And I've really moved towards the social side, the social systems, and like how humans, work together to actually get things done. And tech is important, infrastructure is important, but oh my goodness, people are really important. They're the most important, to make sure that it actually works for everybody and actually can happen, I think.
Noting that at this moment in American history is not one of the peak moments of mutual trust. And so this dealing with climate change, this could either be what brings us all back together, or we're actually all just going to utterly fail because maybe we just can't work together on the level that needs to happen. I mean, does this keep you up at night, or are you optimistic that we'll manage it?
I do think you've hit a really important issue, which is what future are we going to choose? Are we able to talk about this together? Are we going to just go into our corners and say the other side's wrong, and there's no way to talk together? The cool thing is, like, I know a couple groups out there that are working literally on this issue of bipartisan cooperation and depolarization of the issue of climate change. I mean, fundamentally, the issue of climate change should not be a partisan issue, right? It's a kind of a fact of it's happening, and the debate is all about what we do about it, right? That's where you really get a lot of struggle. And I think that's what politics is. You got to kind of work things out through disagreement and so forth. I see a lot of path forward for looking for policies. I have a colleague, Matt Burgess, he works on this with his student, looking for the kinds of policies that have bipartisan support. There's actually strong bipartisan support for renewable energy, for example. There's strong bipartisan support for trying to move more quickly towards EVs and renewable energy in general. Those things are, it seems like very polarized, but when you like do a poll, in Republicans and Democrats, there's actually quite a lot, more than 2/3, support quite a lot of policies that are very conducive for moving forward on climate change. I also have some other colleagues up at Colorado State University, and they are working on bringing together politicians from different parties in workshops, in convenings, to sort of hear each other and talk to each other. What will work in your state? What will work in your state? What's a policy that can actually work with the constituency that we have? The economics are in our favor right now for renewable energy, for example. It's a lot cheaper than coal and oil and natural gas and the alternatives. And so,
and nuclear.
That's an incentive right now, right? But, you need transmission lines, you need siting, there's a lot of things, again, that's sort of social trust that you need, but there's a lot of really good places to collaborate across the aisle, across the parties that we have. And I think it's actually happening more than we know, that it's happening more than we hear about in the news. Unfortunately, the news, it tends to really amplify like the disagreement in our society, I think. What's happening behind the scenes, I have more faith in that, in terms of actually muddling our way through this and actually getting to things to happen and go forward. I don't deny there is a lot of partisan rancor about it. There is a lot of argument. There's a lot of really intractable people who are not going to come around, or see that it's worth even talking to the other side on this. But I do think it's an opportunity. I think it's really important to pay attention to the issue as you framed it, even like to say, hey, how can we work together on this? To not just discard the other side, because what you get if you just discard the other side, depending whatever side you're on, then it's a whiplash. It's like, oh, here we have a policy. Oh no, we're going to get rid of that next time. Okay, here we're going to have it. Okay, no, we're going to get rid of it next time. It's not a fast way to get anywhere.
No.
So I mean, we can't afford the time. Like you said, we can't afford to be slow on this anymore. We have to get more efficient. And so I think looking for these policies that are reasonable for both sides, that where both sides can see some benefit in it. And again, the economics is helping us right now. That will be the way forward. And I guess I'll just say one other thing that I think, and I'm not sure if people would agree with me on this, but sometimes people say, we have to all agree on the physics of climate change, or, the details of the science of climate change. And I don't actually think that's true. I think most people, there's been a lot of polarization around the science of climate change. Is the science true? Is the science not true? And so forth. Personally, I think we can kind of go to solutions. We can say, hey, whatever you think about climate change, what about renewable energy? It's cheap, it's clean. You can build it right here in your state. There's like some benefit to that. And the other thing I've learned from working with stakeholders and all my colleagues that do is sometimes people come around to that issue later. If you start with the most controversial way of framing something and the most difficult way of talking about, like you have to agree with me on the way this is framed as your starting point, you don't get very far in the conversation. I have this phrase I use a lot with talking with people. I say, we meet people where they are. And there may be certain topics I don't talk about with people at all, politics and things, but I try to figure out, where do we have some common ground? Where do we have some overlap? What do you care about? What is your community about? What do you care? What's hurting in your, who's hurting in your community? How's the drought going for you? What is your business about? Like, what kinds of things are you trying to do in your business? Bring up these things that show you actually have an interest in this person and you want to actually connect with them and understand what issues they're dealing with in their business. And they're honestly a lot more likely to then talk to you about what's going on and to actually see, oh, maybe there is some common ground here. Maybe there are some things we can agree about. No land manager, no farmer wants to degrade their land. They all want their land to be healthy, their soil to be healthy, their farm to be productive, their life, to be good, their kids to be, to be healthy, all of those things. There's so much to be in agreement about. And so I feel, again, I'm probably sounding optimistic again, but I feel like there are ways to go about this. And there are several groups exploring, how to have these conversations in ways that are respectful and empathetic of the other side, what people are going through. And that is a way perhaps to then find some common ground. And there are policies, like I said, who, both sides think are pretty good to do. So I think we need to look at the wins, look at those things we can kind of win on. And then, if there's some tough things down the road, we have a little bit of wins and a little bit of trust built to then go to the more harder things.
No, but that's good. So that's a good shift away from arguing for the sake of arguing to actually just working to get stuff done. Well, I am relieved to hear that there are people like you out there working on this, not willing to accept that it's all going to be bad, but actually rolling the sleeves up and doing what it takes to end up in a better place for everyone. Thank you very much for talking to me. I've learned a lot and really enjoyed this, and I appreciate your time.
Well, thanks so much for interviewing me. It was so great to talk to you, and really enjoyed the conversation. It was really lovely. Thanks so much for calling me up and having this conversation, having me on the show.
And that brings us to the end of episode 9. Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents, a series embedded within the Solarpunk Futures podcast, written, hosted, and produced by Christina Della Rocha and Ariel Kroon. This podcast is a part of Solarpunk magazine, which is published by Android Press, which is located on Kalapuya Ilihi, the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon, and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians of Oregon. The opening and closing music for Solarpunk Presents is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol and is available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License. So, thank you again for listening, and until the next episode, stay Solarpunk.